So with that, that leads us to our next session, and I would like to introduce Ronna Brown, who is the President and CEO of Philanthropy New York.
Thank you, Claire. And I want to actually just take a moment on behalf of all of us who attended today to say thanks to the Better Business Bureau, thanks to Baruch and all the sponsors. This has been an amazing morning. I have so appreciated every conversation. And the next conversation that you're all going to hear for the last panel of the day is really the perfect culmination for what we've been talking about so far. From, as Claire said, pivoting to stakeholders, to now talking about our community and how is our community reacting in this moment in time. So for all of you who are now glancing at the bios of the amazing speakers coming up, stop, because I want to just pull out 3 facts for you, one from each person for you to consider. So one of these panelists wrote a nonfiction history of her or his own family called Blood of Liberals. One of these panelists was granted the Officer's Cross Order of Merit from the Republic of Poland. And one of these panelists co-chaired the task force that helped shape key provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act. Sounds like they have nothing in common, right? 3 very different backgrounds. But the reality is that all 3 of them, pretty much like everyone in this room, cares deeply about examining the civic participation in this country, understanding what the barriers are for every person in this country to have equal access to participating, and to look at the opportunities where we can all together change those barriers. So if you didn't skim the bios while I was reading that, who's who? Well, our Blood of Liberals author is George Packer. He's the moderator for the next panel. He's a regular contributor to The New Yorker, most recently the author of The Unwinding, an Inner History of the New America, which was reviewed by David Brooks in the New York Times, and he called it a gripping narrative survey of contemporary America. Our Dodd-Frank influencer is Heather McGhee, president of Demos, a public policy organization working for an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. Many of you who already knew Heather, because she's basically a celebrity, saw her celebrity status go viral last year when she very thoughtfully and with a great deal of empathy answered on a live radio show a person who called and wanted to share his prejudices. And if you haven't heard that, I encourage you to go look at that, hear that interview. And our Officer Cross of Poland winner is Stephen Hines. He's the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and has been a funder and an organizer of work to promote civic life in America and around the world. RBF focuses on democracy and citizen participation, sustainable development, and climate change, where he's been a leader in the Divest Invest movement. And finally, RBF focuses on peace building in the greater Mideast region. And the Nonprofit Times basically names him one of the 50 most influential nonprofit leaders pretty much every year. So with that, I'm going to ask the panel to come up, and I turn it over to George.
I said to Heather, she actually accomplished something. I mean, anyone can win the Cross of Honor of the government of Poland, but or publish a book about your family. I'm a complete foreigner here. I don't speak the language of the nonprofit sector, so I'm going to probably get a lot of things wrong and make some clumsy mistakes, but I might also question that language a little bit because to outsiders it can seem a little bit impenetrable. But before we get to language, let's talk about the purpose of nonprofits in a democracy. So the book that was mentioned, that my last book, The Unwinding, is about really the end of the social contract as Americans knew it in the post-World War II era, which has taken a long time and taken many forms, and affected many institutions. And in that book, I looked at a few individuals around the country, ordinary people whose lives had been sort of thrown along in the upheavals of the economy and of politics and of culture in the last few decades. The institutions that used to support the citizens of the country, especially the middle class, whether it be government or business or media or schools or churches, in every case that I looked at, didn't seem to be present in their lives. It seemed as if they were on their own. I don't look at nonprofits in the book very much. There's one character who goes from being an assembly line worker to a community organizer, so she may be the closest we get. But I wanted to start by asking, what role should nonprofits play, and have they played, in sustaining a democratic society with a strong middle class, and have they been part of the unwinding that the book looks at?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and thanks for having us. It's always a joy to be with George and Heather and have a conversation like this. So, my thesis about this is that the vibrancy of democracy actually depends upon the health, the vitality, and the engagement of citizens through institutions of civil society, nonprofit organizations, associations, clubs, etc. And this has been distinctly American. The strength of this sector is unusual in America. Other countries have it, of course, but ours has been something that has been part of the American story from the very beginning. When you think about Benjamin Franklin, Franklin was kind of the first NGO entrepreneur in America. He founded all kinds of nonprofit organizations, a fire brigade, a library, a hospital, the first volunteer militia, all of which were supported by contributions from citizens. These were not government agencies. And de Tocqueville, of course, documented all of this in his famous work. So it's a hugely important part of our democracy. Without it, the other two sectors, the for-profit sector and the government sector, often get out of balance. It's where we are today. So I think what you all do in NGOs, in civil society, whether you are a service delivery organization, a mobilizer, a think tank, an advocacy group, is absolutely vital to the health of our democracy. And your role today is not a luxury, it's a necessity.
Really well said, Stephen. I also want to join the panel in thanking the organizers of the event for inviting us to reflect on this day, which will, tonight we'll hear from the new president first addressing Congress and hear more about his vision for the country. So I think it's very important that we take this moment to reflect about our role in creating a vision for the country that we can support. So the unwinding, and I really do want to say, if you haven't read the book, you really should. It's really
Okay, I can go now.
It's a really beautiful, beautiful narrative account of something that we have all, each of us, from where we sit, felt, and puts some great stories to recount how we got here. The role of, I believe, the independent or nonprofit sector is in some ways at a crossroads. I've grown up during a period of time where it has flourished. And also I've grown up at a period of time in which the other sectors have sort of pulled away from that social contract. And so I think we really have to ask ourselves, is what we do, and of course the we is large here, as Stephen said, you have social service providers, you have advocacy organizations, you have civic institutions and philanthropic institutions. But is the we that we do setting enough of a norm that is influencing not just those who participate in our sector, but also the much more powerful people who participate in setting the rules of the road in government and in business? And I think manifestly we have to admit that it's not enough. And so that, I think, is one of the challenges we face now. Can we use the voice of this still well-respected sector to hold accountable to a greater degree those who fundamentally are channeling trillions more dollars than we ever will in business and in the private and in the public sector?
Well, let me follow. And by the way, we will have questions. There's some method of having them written down and passed up to me. Beyond that, I don't know. So start thinking of them, and we'll try to get to 15 or 20 minutes at the end. But in around 1964, there was a presidential commission on the future of the economy that Lyndon Johnson organized, with the problem of automation and technology and how workers could be retrained. It was a rather far-sighted, at a time of full employment and a booming economy, a far-sighted look at what was going to happen to American workers in the post-industrial era. At that table were labor leaders, business leaders, church leaders, and I think philanthropic leaders, along with members of the Johnson administration. So what happened to that? Could that happen today? Does that happen today? Or are you all in your separate worlds fighting for your desperate piece of the pie and, in a sense, seeing each other as strangers or as rivals or simply not working on the same fundamental things? So what happened to that vision?
So, I oftentimes when I'm speaking to audiences, particularly of younger people who've lived only in this era that we call the inequality era, who may be familiar with this golden era of shared prosperity and a social contract, but only because they've read things like George's book, not because they've experienced them in the past 40 years in their lives. And I often talk about sort of the players that were necessary to be at the sort of bargaining table when that contract, right, if you just make things very literal, who was sitting at the table to be signatories to that contract. And if you think about that as a post-war social contract, you have to sort of close your eyes and visualize who would have been sitting at that table. And it would have been, the white male president of the United States, the white male president of GM or Ford, and the white male president of the UAW, right? Or, some variations, right, representing labor and business and government. And one of the things that's happened, and we just have to be very honest about this, and not be afraid of acknowledging the truth of the challenge of diversity in a democracy, is that after that golden era of shared prosperity, where the social contract was really written for and by white men, more people started knocking on the door and saying, hey, I want a seat at that table. And then the social contract began to tear. And so right now we're at a moment of rampant economic inequality at a time where corporate profits are near a record high. They've tripled just since 2000, I believe. Actually, 2010, I think they've tripled since. And yet half of American families couldn't pay a $400 bill without going into debt or selling something. In communities of color, criminalization has become the primary relationship that they have to the government. And job discrimination, low pay, wage theft, just sort of kind of regular disrespect at work has become the way they interact with the job. And so we have to really acknowledge that it's not easy to create that same sort of automatic assumption of a shared floor for how a worker should be treated, or how much a citizen's voice should matter in government. When we have all of these embedded beliefs in a hierarchy of human value. And so that today, a cashier who earns $7.25 an hour not only just gets $7.25 an hour worth of, purchasing power for her family, but also only gets $7.25 an hour worth of education for herself, $7.25 an hour worth of esteem in our political culture, and $7.25 an hour worth of voice in our democracy.
Yeah, I might just add, George, to your specific point about that commission in 1964, of course, some pretty big things happened. Vietnam happened. The civil rights movement happened. And the nation, was forced to look at other top-line items on the agenda. And out of that, as we know, we had a succession of things that reduced public confidence in the institutions of our democracy. Vietnam being the first, Watergate, being the bookend. And out of that, a different sense about the role of the individual in American life. Plus, as Heather said, the rising and legitimate demands of those who didn't participate in that golden era of the 1950s. And then one other thing happened, and that was the late 1970s, when leaders in politics decided they were going to, in essence, shrink the government by making it dysfunctional. And this started happening in the late 1970s with the election of people like Newt Gingrich, who made it their mission to make Congress dysfunctional in order that Americans would begin to lose faith in Congress itself. And I'm not making this up out of my own analysis. There's some very good books about this. One is called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And it is. But it was an intentional set of decisions. Now, George has challenged us, I think, to talk about what is our responsibility collectively in this story. And that is a challenging question, because on the one hand, the nonprofit sector has grown dramatically in this period. I think there are now something like 1.4 million 501c3 nonprofit organizations in America. That includes churches and schools and all of us. And that's a huge growth from the 1960s. There's something like 75,000 foundations, my particular part of this community. So there's been this explosion, and Americans are more generous than ever, but we are splintered, we are siloed, we are working on our own set of problems, which is understandable. They're difficult, challenging problems. You're trying to serve people, you're trying to organize communities, you're trying to respond to the crisis du jour, and that leaves less time for building the bridges across the sector that are necessary for us to play our role effectively at a moment of great national challenge. So one of the things I would suggest we all need to think about as we leave this room is how are we going to build those bridges of what Bob Putnam calls bonding social capital. How are we going to construct a civil society that's something bigger than the sum of our parts? Because that's what we need to do if we are really going to get through the moment, preserve and defend and improve our democracy over time.
One analogy to this moment is the Gilded Age and the turn of the last century, the turn of the 19th to the 20th, which was a golden age of philanthropy because there were huge fortunes being created, and those huge fortunes were looking for forms of civic engagement. So we got libraries, we got universities, we got lots of things that in brick and mortar that are still with us. The New York Public Library is a great example.
Right.
So what is the age of inequality today doing to the nonprofit sector? How are the new billionaires who are celebrities and who have so much money to throw around and obviously want the tax breaks that come with it, how do they affect and maybe warp the thinking in the nonprofit sector?
That is a really rich question that I think a lot of the people in this room I could tell in their faces had some thoughts about. I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, honestly, obviously, we need the largesse of individuals in this moment to help support our work. I would say that one characteristic that seems different from the sort of robber barons of yesterday to the tech, that's where a lot of the money is coming from, and Wall Street, financial sector barons of today, is a different sense that they can solve the problem. That it's not creating a public institution, but rather creating an app to solve poverty, right? Doing some reading, talking to some people, developing a strategy, and then going to implement that strategy in a disruptive way to the sector, which is usually actually the public sector itself that they are trying to disrupt. Now, is that always a bad thing? Certainly not. But is that a pretty predominant trend? And does it, in fact, have a pretty sobering effect on what is already the trend of concentrating decision-making power in our politics because of how much that same class of millionaires and billionaires is able to hold sway over the very government decisions, in elections and in lobbying? Yeah, I think we should really be concerned about the sort of new kind of ethos that eschews the public, disrupts the public. If we're concerned about democracy, and if we think, frankly, that ordinary people have a say in solving the problems that we face.
Yeah, so as somebody here representing the first generation of robber barons, John D. Rockefeller made his wealth through unscrupulous and ruthless business practices. But he started giving away immediately. I mean, it's actually quite an extraordinary story. We have at the Rockefeller Archive Center his original personal ledger book, which he started when he went to work at age 16. And he made $45 that year in 1866, I think it was. And he gave away 5 of the 45. So he was already giving away more than 10%. And as his wealth from that period, when he was 16 to the turn of the century, he became the wealthiest person in the world. And he started giving away massive amounts of money. And his theory about this was to go to the root causes, not to try to treat the symptoms. And so they cured a disease that was afflicting millions or hundreds of thousands of people in the South, maybe millions, called hookworm, because they found out that the root cause was that a lot of kids were growing up without shoes. And the worms were getting in through the feet. So this was the kind of style of philanthropy that was passed on generation to generation and still guides the work of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund today. There is something different, as Heather was saying, about the new wealth. It was created through entrepreneurship and single vision, kind of driven by an individual, whether it was Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, et cetera, et cetera. These people are individuals, and they have a very individualistic view. And that is not a communitarian view, which is, I think, the challenge we're facing. How do we build a more communal sense of philanthropy? After all, philanthropy comes from the Greek word meaning love of humankind. And the other dimension of this, and Heather also suggested this, is that many of them see government as irrelevant at best and negative more often, as a negative force in society. Wasteful, inefficient, bureaucratic, riven with politics, et cetera, et cetera. Many of those things, of course, are true because of what we've let happen to government. So they're not interested in actually working with government. They're interested, as Heather said, creating the next app, finding the next social entrepreneurial response. And we need government. And we need to help government work better, and we need to work with government. And so another thing that I think we've got to think about is how do we get work that brings the nonprofit sector, the business sector, and government together bringing the unique assets, the unique expertise that each sector has embedded within it to find solutions to the big problems we face, whether it's economic inequality or climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, I think, the 21st century solution is actually not separating the sectors, but having them work in more collaborative mechanisms while not giving up the other important role, which is of our sector, to be a watchdog. We need to be ready to criticize government. We need to be ready to criticize business. We need to stand up for the people we serve. And that gets a little tricky when you're also trying to collaborate. But we have to do both.
So who do you serve? I mean, every time one begins to generalize about America these days, it immediately collapses under the weight of the incredible polarization that has set into our politics, our geography, our races, our political parties, and our classes. How's that for the heavy weight of division? So how do you conceive of your constituents, and how do they relate to you, and do they participate in the same degree of polarization and division that the country does? Or when they get under the umbrella of a nonprofit, does everyone suddenly start singing from the same hymn book?
So I'll take that first. So at demos, which is also a Greek word, the root word of democracy, means the people of a nation. We think of our constituency as broader than maybe today the political and ideological discourse of progressive versus conservative would indicate. And here's why. Our concern, which is rebuilding the pathways to the middle class in a new and sustainable economy, expanding the freedom to vote, and limiting the power of big money in our politics. Those right now, if you look at some of the framing, some of the policy ideas a little bit, can seem to be sort of partisan political issues where there are massive divides in Washington and in state houses. But if you look at sort of each of those areas, on money and politics, we wrote a public opinion analysis a few years ago looking at cross-ideological support for the idea that there was too much big money in politics, support for solutions like disclosure and small donor-matched public financing, and found that support for all of those propositions didn't go below 8 out of 10 across the ideological spectrum. We ended up calling the report Citizens Actually United, because what actually gets citizens united is the idea that Citizens United as a Supreme Court decision was wrong, right? If you look at questions about how high the minimum wage should be, whether or not someone who works full-time at a minimum wage job should be able to support their family and not be in poverty, Republican base voters think that it should be high enough to avoid poverty. Republican elected officials don't, but Republican-based voters do. If you look at some of the basic questions around whether or not students should go into debt in order to pay for college, which is a new phenomenon that's only been very much part of the unwinding, and everyone remembers when that wasn't the case, when public college was debt-free, you will start to see that same kind of coalescing. So I think that we are in a moment of, I completely agree with you about the cleavages in society, and I think that politics today and the media today has made it an overarching goal to sow distrust of particularly racialized others, but also others in terms of sort of the kind of fiction of the parties, and it's absolutely headwinds. But I do believe that there is hope for speaking to a broad constituency about the fundamental questions of how we order our lives as families, how we can afford to raise families, and how we need to reform the system in a pretty dramatic way that's more in step outside of Washington than it is inside of it.
Are you saying that polarization at least partly or largely manufactured?
Yes. Now, I think it's been being manufactured for some time, so it's certainly sticking, right? I mean, I'm not naive about how much, no matter what I say or anybody else says, then folks get back into their car and turn on talk radio, and it's just all, the voices that want us to come together are quiet indeed compared to those who really have found political and economic headway in really demonizing and sowing distrust and saying, you know what, there are only a few people you can trust, and your neighbor or that community downtown in the inner city or the politicians on the other side are not part of them.
I think one of the things that has made this country great, and it is great, is our blend of capitalism and democracy. Capitalism is an engine of new ideas, of wealth generation, of employment, and democracy is the regulator that keeps capitalism from its excesses, because capitalism unbounded just leads to concentrations of wealth. And throughout most of our history, this balance has been pretty good. And I think it's the balance between these two that has been at the heart of America's success. Today, way out of balance. What we have on the one hand is hyper-capitalism, and on the other hand, impaired democracy. Democracy is impaired because we have laws and procedures that keep people from voting. Democracy is impaired because the rules in Congress keep things from happening. Democracy is impaired because economic inequality produces political inequality, and the rich and powerful have sway in Congress, and everybody else does not. And then Congress sets the rules and the regulations that allow more and more capitalism to succeed. Now, I'm a capitalist, but I'm a Democrat, small d. And I think we've got to restore the balance, because if we don't, we are going to be a very, very different country than the country we imagine ourselves to be. And we have been that country, we can be that country, and again, I think it's up to all of us in civil society to push that agenda.
It's almost as if these days, if you run an organization, you're an elite. And if you're an elite, you are the problem. And you are what's being swept aside by this populist surge that on the left was Sanders and on the right is Trump. And in Europe is all kinds of not so pleasant actors, and in Russia is state-run. So how do you're talking like populists. How do you evade the sense that you're from within an organization, that you have your own interests, imperatives, you've got your own language, as I said earlier, you know each other. How do you avoid being cut off from whatever the feeling of ordinary people who have no connection to any institution like yours is? How do you get outside that?
Well, there's a man in the White House who's a billionaire and managed to sell himself as a populist. So I do think that
Whereas you're a populist who people think is a billionaire. So
I do think that that Americans are willing to, and in fact hungry to hear people who have some level of power and access want to use that power and access on behalf of them. So I don't think it's a deal breaker. There was also something else embedded in your question, though, George, about sort of how do we get out of our bubbles? How do we talk to people who are not something, right? There's always sort of a...
Yeah, this is a recurring bugaboo of mine, because I've worked with them, written about them, and whenever I'm trying to write a magazine article about a civil society organization, even that phrase, I just feel the prose go dead. and I start to get into capacity building, and it doesn't work as writing, and I have a feeling that maybe that's getting at some deeper problem of a kind of insider's language that is abstract and almost diffuses rather than clarifies reality, and it may be part of the effect of this distance between these organizations and the people that you're talking about. So.
No, I think that's a really a really interesting and thoughtful point. The jargon is there. There's no question about it, and we live in it. We perpetuate it. But I would argue that that problem exists at the kind of macro level of the sector. When you talk about the sector as a sector, you get into those kinds of statements. When you get into organizations on the ground serving their communities, it's a very, very different language. It's a very different experience. It's a very different reality. And what we're not doing effectively as a sector is building that story from the bottom up. We are telling it more from this top-down perspective with that kind of elite, jargonistic, not terribly clear or inspiring language. So I really take your critique. I think it's very important. I want to add one other thing to your question, about being elite institutions and leaders of organizations and elite in that sense. That is absolutely true. I think we just have to own that problem. So the key is, how do you build your internal organization and its culture in a way that is not elite, and that you really are committed to the values of diversity and inclusion, and how you do your work and how you compensate your colleagues and how they are involved in the life of the institution. And as some of the earlier panelists were saying, that's hard. That's very hard work. And you all know this because you're doing it every day. It's really, really hard. But we have to be really committed to that. We have to kind of model in our institutions, there's a bad word in and of itself, in our organizations, the kind of community we would like to see more broadly. And then we have to also get out and listen. So in my work, we are a grant maker. And the only way for us to do this well is to be out with the grantees, working with them side by side, seeing their lives, seeing the lives of the people they're serving firsthand, whether it's in a remote rural mountain village in Yunnan province in China where we work, or whether it's in communities in rural counties of the US, many of which disproportionately voted for President Trump. We have to get out there. We have to be on the front lines. We have to listen and reflect and absorb.
So there's actually some great questions coming in, better than the ones I've been asking. So I'm gonna let you all ask the questions now. Do you think Trump is toying with limiting or eliminating tax benefits for charitable contributions in order to create a crisis he can take advantage of to solidify his power? By any chance?
I think the answer is yes. I think that it may not be quite so strategic in the sense that the question implies that there's a real thought behind all of this. I do think that we are, of course, all of us are nonpartisan, and I really do want to say I know in our own organization that there are people who supported President Trump, and we have to be inclusive of them too. So I want to caution myself here, but I do think that we have to watch extremely closely what goes on under the rubric of tax reform, because we are at risk as a sector. The charitable contribution, the tax-exempt status, the mandatory payouts for foundations, the limits on administrative expenses, all of these issues that we have heard discussed by some in Congress for years are likely, in the dead of night, literally, to find their way into a massive tax reform bill that cuts corporate taxes and other things that people are going to really focus on, while losing the story of what may be happening to the health and vitality of this sector. So, yeah.
I couldn't say it better.
There are hundreds of thousands of people engaged in advocacy now who rarely even voted before. How do we keep them engaged?
Yeah.
That is
That's Heather's question.
that is really the silver lining of this moment.
Yeah.
I mean, democracy is not a spectator sport, and it had become one, right? And the historically low turnout of the last midterm election, the not so robust and quite uneven turnout in this most recent presidential election, like 96 million eligible voters did not cast a ballot. But of course, there's more than just voting to elections. And to democracy. And there's more than just elections to democracy. And so the fact that you're seeing organized by, a Facebook post from Hawaii, the largest, and then of course a lot of organization went into it afterwards, but sort of sparked by someone outside of, kind of the infrastructure that usually supports mass mobilizations. You had the largest mobilization in American history, 5 million people the day after the inauguration for the Women's March. And so many of those women and, men had never gone to a demonstration before. A Google Doc on indivisibleguide.org that just, in some ways decoded for citizens what we should already know, which is how to be effective with the people who are paid to represent us, has sparked 6,000 chapters across the country, been downloaded 2 million times, 10 million page views, right? And the town halls, which rocked the country last week and may have turned the page on keeping the Affordable Care Act, which has insured 20 million people. Democracy, and by that I mean the robust civic participation of ordinary people, can and should, and thankfully, because frankly I was getting a little cynical, have an effect. And so the question is, how do we keep it going? Two things that I think we need to watch. One, there is a great amount of work that is done by a colleague organization called Building Movement, the Building Movement Project, which is specifically about how nonprofit social service organizations can see their role in helping to amplify the voice of their clients whom they're giving social services to, and start to be a force for building movement. Download and dust off some of that work, because now is the time for it. We know that if the sort of budget vision, either of Trump, which is different, or of Ryan, goes through, which it very much could, given the dominance of the party in Congress, the social safety net will be massively, massively underfunded. So it's time to see our constituents in the social service sector as some of those active participants. And then finally, I do think that there is a sort of strategy of distraction that is going on that we are all sort of vulnerable to, but sort of the basic questions of what is at stake for me and for my family and for my community, and the basic enduring questions of what kind of America do we stand for, are where we need to sort of keep our eyes focused, and those questions are what compel people to speak out again and again, no matter what is sort of coming at us from Twitter or elsewhere.
So there's several questions that kind of get at a similar problem. One is, what are the masks? Has the increased reliance on nonprofits on government money co-opted our sector's role and efficacy and our independence? And kind of a contrary question asks, how can we call out the disproportionate influence of business on government through so-called foundations and nonprofits? So I guess one of them is about whether you have become too dependent on government and lost some independence, and the other is about whether you're being undermined by business front nonprofits that are influencing government and that may be sort of mixing the pot.
Well, just a quick thought. I think both of them are real phenomena and risks to our sector. But working with government contracts is a necessity. And there's some very good aspects to it. And those of you who are the recipient of government funding know that the bureaucratic elements, the reporting, the accounting, and all of that can be mind-numbing. But nevertheless, you are in a better position often to actually deliver the intended service than a formal agency of government. And I worked for 15 years in government, including running the welfare system in the state of Connecticut for 6 years. So, I kind of saw this firsthand. We were much better when we were in partnership with community-based organizations. And so I think that we want to make sure that you don't become entirely reliant on government funding, because then your independence is completely reduced. And the independence of this sector is its greatest asset. You know, we can take risks that politicians won't take because of politics. We can take risks that businesses won't take because of profit motive. We can call people to account. We can be the advocates for the people we serve, and our independence is really the foundation of all of that. So I would say if you are taking government funding or have government contracts, that's good. Don't let it become the entire economic model of your organization.
What about the
Yeah.
nonprofits that go by the name of Americans for Prosperity?
Yeah.
So sunlight is an important disinfectant, and I do think that we need to be willing to say that not everything that is organized needs to be tax deductible. Right? I mean, that's really what we're talking about here, is whether or not whether or not the activity can happen, but whether or not it should be done under the guise of tax deductibility. And I also think that we have a role to play in, echoing what Stephen said about the independence, in creating, and this is not so much for Demos, which is an advocacy organization, but others who are who have a more independent voice to say that, you know what, I think our government is not working as well, and I see this in my community because of the influence of, organized corporate money. That has not been sort of, lots of different people across the country have raised the alarm about, the kind of infrastructure that is the channel for the already wealthy and powerful to exert their influence over government. But the independent sector, who actually is really seeing, folks who are seeing close up how government decisions that should be sort of no-brainers about investments in the public are warped because of the influence of corporate lobbying, have a role to play in sort of just changing the set of stakeholders who, even in local media, is saying, hey, there's a problem here.
So let me put you on the spot a bit. You both begun sentences with the words, we have to. Mm-hmm. We have to spur citizen participation. We have to break down. So let's say that the fundamental theme that we're wrestling with today is a weakened state of democracy. Mm-hmm. Which involves a severing of the bonds between citizens, or among citizens, I should say, and between citizens and the institutions, including you guys. So how should all the people here, who are all doing different things, mm-hmm. and probably all are thinking, well, that doesn't fit with my organization, how do you, give me an idea. Mm-hmm. Give me an idea that we can leave the room with.
Yeah. So one, I think remembering that oftentimes we can be an uncommon voice, as I was just referring to, for example, weighing in on, even a small sort of specific issue in your local or state politics where you see that, the community's interests are not being served because private interests are. That it's in and of itself, I think, helps change the narrative a bit. Rana referenced this interaction that I had with a caller on C-SPAN show Washington Journal in August, where he said, I'm Gary from North Carolina. I'm a white male, and I'm prejudiced. And then we went on to have a conversation. And then we went on after that to have many conversations. I just talked to him for the last time on Sunday. I went down to visit him in North Carolina, and he has set on a path to transform his life. He fully is on what he calls this walk to uproot prejudice and bias in his life and to understand and have more empathy for the people of color whom he frankly was terrified of. Until our conversation helped give him permission to move in a different direction. I do believe that there are a number of initiatives right now across the country that are about creating community dialogue. The Kellogg Foundation has a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort that some people in this room may be involved with, Demos is involved with, that has a pretty robust curriculum around how to create community level healing across difference and engage the nonprofit sector, local business, government, and but most importantly, just ordinary folks. The level of vitriol in this campaign cycle, the amount of sort of a resurgence and rebranding of white supremacy is terrifying to people of all races. Right? I think this is a moment when a lot of white Americans who thought there were some questions that were settled are now having to sit at their kitchen tables and say, okay, what should I do to be on the right side of history in this issue while I'm worried about my retirement and my children's school and all of that. And I believe that we do have, therefore, an opening for the values that many of us in this room have committed our lives to have a new audience and to have more people pick up the mantle of participating in those efforts. So we shouldn't be shy. I think there's very much a, oh God, we didn't know this country could possibly have done this, that a lot of progressives and social mission folks kind of are in this sort of paralysis after the election. I think that politics are very, very, we're at a moment of massive realignment and, a different vision won 3 million more popular votes, right? I mean, we really shouldn't sort of retreat from the sense that people want equality and fairness and justice. And we should give more of an invitation for people perhaps who are not part of our core constituency to engage in that level of work.
Yeah, I would just add that I think this moment calls on all of us. And I know this is a big ask, but I think it calls on all of us just to do more. And I say that with great respect for the people in this room because I have some sense of what your lives are like. You are working really hard, serving the communities you serve, providing the services you provide, and you go home exhausted, inspired perhaps many days, but exhausted, and then you have to take care of your families, and it's tough. But this is a moment that calls on us all to do more. And if you're a community health organization, think about how you can work with the people you serve to create an advocacy cell that participates in the effort to make sure we save the Affordable Care Act. Think outside the normal boundaries. At the foundation that I work at, we're trying to push ourselves to do that, and we're going to frankly, increase our level of spending above the 5% and dip into the endowment that the Rockefeller family created for the foundation because this is a moment of real urgency. And we just all have to do more. We have to get out of those places, and even as hard as we're working, we've got to work more. We've got to work more together. We've got to go to the marches. We've got to demonstrate our civic impulse. Because that is what's going to make the difference. That is what's going to create the healthy balance again between democracy and capitalism. It's when the people say, no, enough. It's time for something different, something that actually feels more like the America we believe in. And we have to make it happen. If you look at, and Rana mentioned my work in Poland, I had the great pleasure of working in Eastern Europe right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I learned so much in that experience. One of them was things can change. The Berlin Wall, I happened to go through the Berlin Wall, through Checkpoint Charlie, a month before it came down. And on the day I went through, I thought this could never change. And 1 month later, things were changing, and then the revolutions just carried on throughout Eastern Europe. So things can change. The second is, and Heather said this earlier, democracy is not just the processes, the mechanisms, and the institutions. Those are the easy part. And I saw this in Eastern Europe. They created new parliaments. They opened up the freedom of the press. They had free and fair elections. They did all that pretty quickly, and it was very impressive. But what we're seeing now in places like Hungary, where they're pulling back, is that they didn't create the mechanisms of nurturing the culture of democracy. which is actually the most important part. And the culture of democracy, the habits of democracy, are built in community. And that's the work all of you do. So I just have to say, we all have to do more. We all have to do more together. And we have to just keep at it, because this is a moment where, as Heather says, we have a real opportunity, actually, to build the America that we all dream about, and it can be real.
I think it would be foolish not to end with that. Thanks,
Thank you.
thanks,
Thank
Heather.
you very
Thanks,
much.
Stephen.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you all.
I was so engrossed in what they were saying, I forgot I had to come up here. So, thank you so much. You know, all of us, I hope that this is what you needed today. Eyes wide open. We heard some positive notes this morning about the trust in NGOs. That's a good thing. But we also have heard from each one of these sessions that we have work to do through any time, but particularly now. So speaking now from the BBB's point of view, what do you need? You know, we're here. We bring people together for programs like this. We have standards for charities so they at least have a path to go down that they can feel pretty secure about. What do you need? Let us know. You have evaluations in your kit. A couple of points for you. Karen Kunstler-Goldman, who works with our Charities Bureau, asked me to mention to you that there's an influentials list. It's a periodic email, messages from the Charities Bureau. Karen, you want to stand? So I think everybody knows you anyway, but give your cards to Karen and she'll be sure that you get put on that list. Thank you for mentioning that. So, number one, thank you again to our sponsors. KPMG was our benefactor sponsor. American Express was another major sponsor. And New York Community Trust. We can't do this without you, so thank you so much. And thanks to our program committee members and all of our event supporters. And again, please fill out those evaluations. We do read them. And accept our invitation, please, for another one of these gatherings on March 28th, when we'll be talking about advancing fundraising techniques, risks, rewards, and reporting requirements. And that is sponsored generously by Eisner-Amper. So save the date, too, for September 26th, another workshop in the fall for sponsored by Fiscal Management Associates. I want to thank Luana again for her part in putting this together, and all of you. I hope that you found this to be a helpful day and an inspiring day, and one that gives you a light at the end of the tunnel. I know it has for me. So once again, thanks to everybody, and thank you for being here today.